Yeah, so this is the Vegan Time Tunnel, and we're building up an archive of significant events in the animal movement. And we're up to what you might call the infamous McLIBEL trial. So we're going to go through a few interesting details. Welcome along then to the Vegan Time Tunnel. Yeah, right. So I've called it Justice versus Macdeaths. That's one of the McLIBEL. They used to produce a lot of signs: Mac Profits, Macdeaths, Mac SHIT, etc., etc. So there's a lot going on. We talk about the 1990s here. So we're also talking about the longest English libel trial. That's what we're dealing with. So according to Wikipedia, this will get us kicked off. That font of knowledge, the original case lasted nearly 10 years, which according to the BBC, so must be true, made it the longest running libel case in English history. McDonald's announced that he did not plan to collect the £40,000 it was awarded by the courts. Now, there's a bit of a story about that because that implies that McDonald's won the case. It was kind of halfy as we'll see. Helen Steele, one of the McLIBEL 2, announced when they came out of court that they would not pay what they were ordered to pay, and she said, "Well, anyway, we're broke, so that they're not going to get a penny out of us." And following the decision, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in Steele and Morris versus the United Kingdom that the pair had been denied a fair trial in breach of Article 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is the right to a fair trial. And their conduct should have been protected by Article 10 of the Convention, which protects the right to freedom of expression. The court awarded judgment then of £57,000 against the British government. Now, as I mentioned, there's lots and lots of resources on this one. This one, for example, this is the McLIBEL full documentary. And if you can see that there in the bottom corner, it's Spanner Films. So if you go to YouTube and put in Spanner Films, you'll see that. So this is the documentary which shows the defendants going through the case. There's a really interesting bit where I think it's Helen Steele, one of the defendants. It's Helen Steele and Dave Morris. I think she had a bit of a burnout, and so she kind of just had to have a few days off and kind of called in sick to the court, as it were. She walked up a mountain in order to just clear her head. And at the top of the mountain, there was some McDonald's rubbish. So she was thinking, well, there you go. Yes, probably went on the welfare grant. Yeah, you never know, do you? Okay, so Spanner Films for the McLIBEL documentary, which is pretty good. There's also a fairly new, this is like the newest thing, I think, in terms of what's out there, is this thing from the BBC, but this is BBC Radio called The Reunion. I've put the audio onto my YouTube channel, so you can find that there. That's quite interesting because the defendants are looking back. The leader of the opposition in Britain, Sir Keir Starmer, was their lawyer, and he kind of did that free before he was corrupted by politics, folks. So there's also been some reconstructions of the trial. These are really quite interesting as well, actually going through the transcript of the court, all the kind of intricate arguments that went on. It's really quite an interesting thing. And there's part 1 and part 2. And this is all on Paul Gravett's YouTube channel. And Paul was one of the original defendants. So McDonald's originally sued 5 people, and 3 of them ended up apologizing on the grounds that they were told that they couldn't win. So if you go to Paul Gravett's YouTube channel, you'll be able to see these kind of reconstructions, which are really quite good. Macdeath is in trouble over here now for violating child. Oh, right. What a shock. Not. Yes. Well, indeed. You wouldn't kind of be too shocked no matter what they, what they violated, really. Obviously, they've been very kind of anti-union, and so that could be tied into that, getting underage workers, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all, Deb, not one bit. Paul Gravett is an interesting character because he was a McLIBEL defendant, but he was also been involved with the spy cops thing, which has kind of been a bit of a scandal, which I'm going to kind of come on to in more detail a little later. But one of the McLIBEL too, Helen Steele, was involved with that. So Spy Cops has got a website. I'll show you that a little later on. Also, Paul was part of the Radicals and Revolutionaries series. As I said, Helen Steele was one of the women who were deceived by the Spy Cops. And so this is a book that she co-wrote about that deep deception. And there's also, going back to McLIBEL itself, this is a book that John Vidal, well-known columnist for The Guardian, wrote, McLIBEL Burger Culture on Trial. And then apart from those substantive things, there's quite a lot of other things which are quite interesting. So if you kind of Google McLIBEL, Google Helen Steele, this is the Radical History Network, and they're interviewing Helen Steele there, as you can see. Now, I don't know whether you can see, in fact, I'm not even sure if I can see that. Let me see if I can get this full screen so I can read it. Because she was saying that she was involved in London Greenpeace, various different campaigns. Housing was a campaign. They did work against the poll tax. They did environmental campaigns. They did animal rights. They supported strikers. And she said that she would involve lots of different struggles. And she was also a paid and unpaid driver at times, taking poor pensioners around and also groups of kids and that kind of stuff. So this really was kind of fairly kind of standard in the 80s and 90s, with animal activists being involved with lots and lots of different things. Okay, so let's go through the timeline for today then. So we start off as early as 1985. And this is when London Greenpeace launched the campaign against McDonald's. 1986, first publication of their leaflet, What's Wrong with McDonald's? Now, the interesting thing about the history of that is that it wasn't known until very recently that one of the spy cops helped write this. So one of the people spying on them helped write the leaflet that got them into trouble. 1990 is when McDonald's fight back, and they sue London Greenpeace. Then 1994, the actual trial itself begins. 1995, in June of the year, McDonald's offered to settle the case by donating a large sum of money to a charity chosen by Dave and Helen. Helen and Dave secretly recorded the meetings, and there was a stipulation in this kind of offer that McDonald's said that they could criticize McDonald's, go on criticizing them, but only privately. So in other words, they could criticize McDonald's to their friends, but they weren't allowed to continue distributing the leaflet, and they weren't allowed to talk about McDonald's on the media. So that was the kind of criteria that was brought into play in terms of this offer of donating to a charity. Steele and Morris write back, and they said that they would agree to these terms, but only if McDonald's ceased advertising its products to the public and only recommended the restaurant privately to friends. In other words, exactly the same as the McDonald's, wanted them to do. And of course, you won't be surprised to find out that McDonald's refused that counter offer. On the 19th of June, 1997, Sir Justice Bell delivered a more than 1,000-page judgment. Okay, so when we go to what actually happened, Helen and Dave were found liable on several points, but the judge also found against McDonald's. So that's what I was saying. It's a kind of like, some bits they won, some bits they didn't. Bell ruled that McDonald's had endangered the health of both their workers and their customers by misleading advertising. The advertising thing was a big part of it. That even features in the Animals film. They were trying to suggest that hamburgers were grown in a hamburger patch. So you got Ronald McDonald kind of running over, a little bridge with a couple of kids into the hamburger patch, and all that. So a lot of hype and a lot of distortion of reality of where they got their flesh from, of course. It was also decided by the judge that McDonald's exploit children. This is where the idea of pester power came in. And so the idea was that they would start to advertise to the children and not to the children's parents. And this was in particular when they used to start doing things like advertising heavily in a lead up to a new Disney film and that kind of thing. And then they would do this thing about, well, if you buy a Happy Meal, you'll get a free character from the film that is about to come out or is just being released. I was a projectionist at the time, and I was pretty infuriated by all this, because I do remember that when it comes up, get a free toy, in very small writing, was a message to the parents saying there is an extra charge for the toy. And as I said, I was a projectionist at the time in Bangor, North Wales. So I had a slide projector out of a different porthole, and I kind of put an alternative message on the screen at the time, let's put it that way. So what makes McDonald's and similar chains so pernicious is how they often attract families there. And so it was a case where it became very, very popular for kids to have their kind of birthday parties at McDonald's. It became a really, really important thing. And again, this is all kind of part of pester power. The parents didn't necessarily want to go, but they were kind of dragged there by their children, in effect. And in terms of what was said at the time, but this is a long time ago when you think about it, said the chain reportedly serves 1.2 billion Happy Meals every year. So that's a heck of a lot of Happy Meals, and I would say it's probably bound to be, rather more than that. In terms of Happy Meals, what was the alternative message? I can't remember now. That's what it is. But I'm just going to digress and show you a little bit of my sociology lecture that I did at VegFest a few years ago. And this talks about the Happy Meal and a particular kind of weird thing that happened. And so have a listen to this.
This issue came back into my consciousness a few years after the research in a kind of weird and unusual place. And it was this. Came back as a McDonald's Happy Meal. And in fact, there's a YouTube of the illustrator talking about this. And he's kind of going, wow, I did the illustrations for this book. And now McDonald's have done it on the Happy Meal. How fab is that, as it were? But I was thinking, wow, there's a bit of a disconnect there, isn't there? Somebody draws pictures of happy animals, and now there's bits and pieces of animals in this box. But in fact, it is actually quite easy to think about. And the real key to it is the word happy. We've got other animals on happy farms, and what better to perpetuate this myth than that they find themselves in a Happy Meal. So everything is happy, right from birth to slaughter, which is never mentioned in the first place. So it's not particularly difficult to think that these other animals find themselves on the cover of a McDonald's Happy Meal. It's not as shocking as we might initially think.
Going back to the findings then, McDonald's were responsible for the infliction of unnecessary cruelty to other animals. And this might feed into what Deb said earlier, that they had a negative attitude towards unionization, and they also paid very low wages. There's also a lot of controversy about this thing, which I think was called the hustle. And of course, this is where you get the idea of fast food, in the sense that there was a particular, it's all like time and motion, which was a big deal in the 1970s anyway, right across industry. I used to work at Ford's, and every action was timed to the second on the production line. But it would have also been the case in the fast food industry, where you've got a certain amount of seconds to get it out, kind of thing. And so that was always seen as a real problem for McDonald's, and that's one of the reasons why they resisted allowing any kind of unions in there. Okay, let me just drop this out for a couple of minutes. Just to put a bit more background in terms of London Greenpeace itself, the anarchist group. And most of this material comes from Gravitt's appearance on Radicals and Revolutionaries that I mentioned before. We're talking about it emerging in the 1970s out of the anti-nuclear movement. That's its kind of real kind of background. It predated and was distinct from the more famous environmental group, as I mentioned, Greenpeace International. Gravitt kind of suggested that London Greenpeace was more anarchic than the general animal rights movement. But I don't think that would have been the case across the board, certainly not in terms of the grassroots. It was the grassroots that did all these kind of entanglements of oppression and liberation type stuff. So they would have also connected the dots. Because he said, for example, that things they were involved with were things like class war, which is another anarchist movement, animal rights, the movement, animal welfare, really. The Greens, that was part of it, even though that was seen as more moderate. But then they organized or part organized, or they were involved in a few events called Stop the City. I did a couple of them, I think. And that was where thousands of people would actually just kind of bring London to a grinding halt, as it were. It takes absolutely thousands of people to do it. And I do remember on those ones that every time anybody went past McDonald's, the place got smashed up. So that was one of the kind of connections to it. I think in the second one, every time you approached a McDonald's, you could see a big cordon of police around it to protect it. There's also feminist kind of strands to all of this. And again, it's really what David Nibert calls the entanglements of oppression and liberation. This was kind of standard stuff for these kind of collaborating movements back then. I always tell my own story about the fact that it was, we would often go on a hunt sab on a Wednesday and a Saturday, but on a Sunday you might go to a national march or a regional event or something a bit more illegal. But then during other parts of the week, you'll be going to Rock Against Racism gigs, or you might be taking part in a Reclaim the Night event. I remember going to a few of those in Manchester, for example. And so it was all seen as kind of part and parcel. Paul Gravitt says that the original 1986 leaflet was fairly high quality at the time. And I do think that's probably right, although it was black and white. It seemed to be pretty high quality. The original was 6 pages long, and it's actually difficult to find it. This picture that I found today might be the one. You can see that it's certainly the fold out one, but I think it was condensed to 4 pages in the end, but it was originally 6. And then in relation to the bigger picture, this is not really the formatting that I'm familiar with, but this is a children's version of the controversial leaflet. So we used to give both of these out in Dublin, and the children's one was very popular, funny enough. In terms of the points that were raised by the leaflet, which ended up getting them into all the trouble, the language used, some versions talked about animal rights, but the more famous ones, unfortunately, talk about animal welfare. But the environment is in there, of course, workers' rights, the exploitation of children, the advertising bit again. And then recycling and litter was a big issue at the time. When I worked in a cinema in Romford, which is in a county called Essex, just not far outside of London, a McDonald's opened while I was working there. So I think we're talking about 1979. Some environmental groups used to go around the city or the town, collecting all this stuff and then dump it onto McDonald's doorstep, because there was a heck of a lot of it. In the end, they kind of employed people to go around picking up the rubbish. They kind of used it to their own advantage in a way, in the sense that they would then have one of those kind of old kind of fashioned dust carts that you kind of, somebody pushes along. And of course it would be festooned with McDonald's adverts and everything. Because I do remember that it worked out that every meal from McDonald's contained about 8 or 9 items of litter. Right, as I said, of the 5 people sued, none of them had written the leaflet. So this is the kind of ironic part of it that I suppose wasn't really known even during the trial, because I suppose they were all, it's a little bit like all anarchic groups. There's a lot of collaboration and everything, but it turned out that one of the spy cops, somebody called Bob Lambert, had taken part in the writing. But ironically, none of the 5 who were picked out by McDonald's, because they obviously had difficulty getting the names of people, but the 5 names that they did get in the end were not involved with the writing of the leaflet. So 2 of them decided to stand up to McDonald's, as I said, Helen Steele, and Dave Morris. The other three apologized, including Paul Gravett, who explains all that in Radicals Revolutionary. He said he was advised that he couldn't win, and he was advised by their lawyer. In fact, McDonald's had a history of suing or threatening to sue people or organizations for many years. In Britain, various newspapers were either sued or threatened, including The Guardian, over reports about poor working conditions in McDonald's restaurants. TV channels were threatened or sued, including the BBC. BBC were sued, for example, for a BBC Two program, which is called Nature, which was commenting on the destruction of the rainforest in Central and South America. Channel 4, which was a fairly new channel. Veggies Limited. Now, Veggies is a vegan food co-op, despite the name, and they specialized in turning up at all the animal rights marches and demos with their big kind of vegan food stalls and everything. They devised the vegan Mars bar, which, as you might imagine, was pretty popular. The singer Morrissey was sued by McDonald's. And then in 1990, McDonald's turned their attention to Steele and Morris. And didn't they threaten to sue a woman in Scotland? Yes, that is true. Yeah, that's right. And in fact, I think also maybe a farmer too. Now, obviously, this is where things get quite absurd with these corporations, in the sense of, McDonald's in Scotland, come on, right? I mean, how many McDonald's are going to be in Scotland? We've got Morris and Steele being the two defendants in the end. They were described as a gardener and a former postman from London. So this meant that one of the richest corporations in the entire world sued two of the poorest people. Helen Steele was on £65 per week, and Dave, at the time, was unemployed. Did I miss something there? Did I miss a comment? How could they sue over scientific? Well, because Steele and Morris ended up getting lots and lots of experts. So this is all in the McLIBEL thing and the reconstructions. This is a fascinating story because they had to kind of go right around the world and ask experts, on things like rainforest destruction and everything to give evidence. And of course, they didn't have any money, so they had to get these people to bring themselves, essentially. Whereas McDonald's had this massive team of some of the most highly paid legal people in the world against them. They tried to sue Supermax in Ireland. Ah, right. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah, Supermax. I think Supermax was one of the fast food places that really kind of hung out and didn't have a plant-based option until very recently. I don't know whether they still have. I don't know whether it came and went or what, because I don't go near those kind of places. But, there's a great joke where, talk about corporations and big things versus small things. There's a person with a small shop and a big supermarket opens up to the left of them. And then a couple of months later, another big supermarket to the right of them. And so he changed the name of his shop to Entrance, which is pretty good. So everybody walked into the middle of it. Those death corporations always think that they can say whatever they want. Their superiority complex is over the top. Yeah, well, I guess for them, it's always about market share, isn't it? And it's also they're competing in a very competitive market, which is why I've always kind of made the point that if you think about it, you would think that of all people, McDonald's probably wouldn't need to advertise ever again. I mean, who doesn't know McDonald's, right? But they advertise on an almost daily basis. In fact, we've had people come up to the stall in Dublin and say, you people should stop pushing your views and people. And I used to say, how many McDonald's restaurants and adverts have you walked past to tell us this? Right. Okay, so going back to what Paul remembers in terms of the trial, he said that he remembers that there was 36 pre-trial hearings. Oh yeah, going back to the McDonald's and why they need to advertise, there's a sociological survey done once, a global one. It turned out that the Golden Arches was more recognizable to children throughout the world globally than the Christian cross in the end. And so that goes to show the reach of these kind of corporations. But even they still need to advertise on a regular basis because they're in such a competitive market. So there was 36 pre-trial hearings. It's the longest libel trial in British history, 31 months, which is 3 times longer than any other trial. There was no legal aid at the time, and so that meant that the defense had to defend themselves. And again, the best account of that is in that McLIBEL spanner one that I showed you before. It also wasn't a jury trial. That was one of the things that McDonald's insisted that there shouldn't be a jury trial. And of course, they will have been worried that if a jury of ordinary people and legal virgins, as a jury is supposed to be, they would look at the imbalance, right? And they would see 2 people struggling to create their defense against the might of McDonald's. And so obviously McDonald's thought, well, we can't have that. It looks so bad, right? And so they convinced the judge it should be him only. They claimed that the rationale for it was that the trial was very complicated and it was too complicated for a jury of ordinary people to understand. So that in itself says something, I suppose. McDonald's founder used to say that he's not a hamburger business, he's an a property business. Yeah, that is true. There's a clip in the Animals film where this guy has been interviewed and he's kind of, in raptures about McDonald's and everything. And he's going, I think we're the Tiffany's of the hamburger business and all this kind of stuff. They had this kind of interesting public persona, and obviously Ronald McDonald was central to all of that, right? But I think it was a pretty ruthless corporation behind it. Hence the McLIBEL leaflet, in fact, where you've got the Ronald McDonald mask, and then you've got the corporate person behind it. I don't know whether people will know this, but the original actor who played Ronald McDonald, he quit. He went vegetarian. I don't know whether he ever went vegan. He did apologize to children. And in fact, he put a book out all about that. And he was saying that he was very sorry that he misled children for so many years. So I suppose that's pretty neat, I guess. He'd done a lot of talks about it. If I remember correctly, although again, I don't have a note on this, I think he might be on YouTube, but I can't remember. You'll have to Google Ronald McDonald to get the name. It's quite a long name, but I can't remember what it's called. Begins with G, I think. And there's Ronald McDonald. Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, there's one of those in Dublin, which when you first see it, you kind of think, seriously, that you've got a wing of a hospital with a McDonald's sign on it, and you're just thinking, are you serious? And apparently, I think McDonald's kindly offered meals and stuff for this wing. So you almost like couldn't make things up sometimes when it comes to what these corporations are prepared to do. Paul says that the trial ended up being a public relations nightmare for McDonald's. To such an extent, he says that they won't even talk about it. Their line now, they've got this kind of stock standard line now, and said, well, that was a long time ago. That was then, this is now. We're a different company now. And so, we don't want to dwell on the past and all this kind of stuff. I think Paul regrets apologizing. And he says that the brave decision by Helen and Dave, and the result itself, of course, probably stopped a lot of other companies from going to law to challenge the people challenging them. And he thinks that that might certainly be the case with vivisection concerns in Britain in the 80s and 90s, that they were kind of thinking about going to law to shut down, injunct some campaigners. And then the McDonald's thing happened. And of course, they thought better of it after that. It became clear over the years that the London Groupies group had been heavily infiltrated by both the police and corporate spies from McDonald's. So there was agencies working for McDonald's and the police themselves infiltrating the group. And now this infiltration dates back, in fact, to the 1960s. There is a kind of comical thing where it's said that if you look at the minutes of the London Greenpeace, the meetings, there was more spies in the meetings than campaigners sometimes. And then there's even this idea that because the McDonald spies didn't know who the police spies were, and vice versa, they ended up kind of spying on each other. And then I think they kind of sorted all that out and kind of let it be known who's who, that kind of thing. So this idea of going back to the 1960s, there was in 1968, there was a march in London, March the 17th, and that ended up being a riot outside the US Embassy. And 10,000 people had taken part in a rally in Trafalgar Square, but there was a break-off group and they moved towards the US Embassy. The embassy was surrounded by police eventually, and also these mounted police officers that you can see. The Labour MP, was called Peter Jackson, complained of police violence and of them using horses as weapons. I remember that quite well. I once attended, must have been 85, 84, a demo outside a fur farm called Cock Sparrow Farm. It was a peaceful demonstration, as I remember it. And then it got to around about 4:30, and it was getting a bit dusky. And so I think that the police decided that they're going to have to move the demo, which was right outside the fur farm at that stage. So they lined up their horses and just charged. And a lot of people had to kind of jump into a cabbage field, which was kind of along the way, and ended up being called in the press something like the cabbage field riot or something. But it was the police who started it. A pensioner got trampled by a horse. Anyway, going back to the London thing, 200 people were arrested, 20 injured, including 25 police officers. And so that was a catalyst, according to Paul Gravett, to this spy cop thing, which ended up being the big kind of scandal. And it's still ongoing. He said the British state thought that this was a threat to its ability to control the population. And so they thought they had to do something about it. And they responded with setting up something called the Special Demonstration Squad, which started this infiltration. And so the full account of that is in the first one of Paul Gravett's Radicals and Revolutionaries. And we now know that some of the police spies had relationships with the real activists, and some of them even had babies with the real activists before they mysteriously disappeared. There's one shocking story where one of the women who was duped by a spy cop, he kind of suggested that he was burning out and everything, and then just disappeared. And then it turned out that he'd gone back to his station, which was only a couple of miles away from where this woman lived, had a shave and cut his hair and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose, when you're an anarchist, you know, all the cops look the same. And so she didn't know for many, many years. It was a real kind of scandal. So that a lot of them just mysteriously disappeared. There's a timeline about all this, which won't go through, which is on spycops.co.uk. The figures, though, that is produced by this group are quite frightening. For example, 1,000 groups were infiltrated over the years, and they targeted what they regarded as the left. More than 30 women were deceived into intimate relationships with the police officers. 42 identities of dead children were stolen, and this is the process by which they adopted a new identity. You go to a graveyard and you find the name and details of a child who had died as an infant, and then you'd recreate that kind of person, and you end up with their birth certificate, and you end up with a driving license in that name and all this. I don't know how to do it, but I've met people who reckon that they do. At least 3 female officers had intimate relationships with activists. Now, whether that's included in the 30 women, I'm not sure, or whether we're talking about 33 altogether in terms of, I don't know, obviously things like sexual orientation there. So I'm not sure about that detail. And then coming to the end, this is the podcast thing on the Spy Cops thing, which is really quite interesting. I had to listen to a couple of these. Institutional sexism was quite interesting. And of course, there's been some scandals of late about police officers being found guilty of sexual assault. And then in terms of the first one, which is called consent, it was the idea of them being duped into a relationship, which they would not have chosen if they'd have known who they were dealing with. And so that was obviously a consent thing. One person, for example, described that she was 19 years old at the time, and so duped into this kind of relationship. You know, the issue is the difference between sex and the R word there, which is interesting. Going back to the sexism, I remember a demonstration in Liverpool that I attended and I was arrested for. It's outside something called the Devil's Tower, which was a vivisection block, a part of Liverpool University. So we dubbed it Devil's Tower. We had a camp outside there and everything for a few weeks, I believe. And there was a couple of bigger events and, you know, occupations and all this kind of stuff. And so there was a few people arrested and thrown into a van. And I was one of those, and this copper got in. And I remember him reaching over and just grabbing the breasts of one of the female demonstrators. And he said to his colleague, "Oh, I've never felt a veggie before." That's what you're dealing with sometimes. And apart from the usual thing about once they arrested vegans, they would always offer them egg sandwiches and all this kind of stuff, along with the usual stuff that they do with prisoners anyway. Like if you need toilet paper, they give you one sheet, you know, this kind of stuff. A lot of crap that goes on. So that's your time tunnel. And thank you so much, as always, for tuning in to the Vegan Time Tunnel.